At 9:42 a.m. on July 14, 1944, First Lieutenant Evald Swanson sat in the cockpit of a B-17G Flying Fortress, nicknamed Mispa, watching dark clouds of flak burst across the sky above Budapest. At 24 years old, with 17 combat missions under his belt, there was zero room for error. The Luftwaffe had stationed more than 288mm flak guns around the railway yards below, and every single one was firing relentlessly. Swanson's B-17 was part of a 60-aircraft formation from the 483rd Bomb Group, operating out of Sturparone, Italy. On paper, the mission was straightforward. Strike the Shell oil refinery and railway yards in the heart of German-occupied Budapest, cut the supply lines feeding the Eastern Front, and make it back home. But by July 1944, bomber crews in the 15th Air Force knew the grim statistics all too well. Out of every 10 men who climbed into a B-17, 8 would never return. Some would die in combat, some would be taken prisoner, and others would vanish without a trace. Undeterred, the formation pushed forward through the curtain of flak, shells exploding in black puffs that could shred aluminum like tissue paper. Mispa took hits to its tail section first, then its wings. Shrapnel punched holes through the fuselage, yet the bomber held its position in the formation. Behind Swanson, his crew stood firm at their posts. Second Lieutenant Paul Berndt occupied the co-pilot's seat. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley manned the bombardier station in the nose, and Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson navigated from the adjacent compartment. 8 more men were stationed throughout the aircraft: radio operators, gunners, and the flight engineer. Seconds away from the target, Dudley released the bomb load, 2 tons of high explosives plummeting toward the railway yards below. The B-17 lurched upward as the weight lifted, but in that exact moment, an 88mm shell struck the nose. The explosion was instantaneous. The entire forward section of Mispa vaporized. The nose compartment, the bombardier station, the navigator's position, the Norden bomb site, the plexiglass panels, everything forward of the cockpit simply ceased to exist. Dudley and Henderson were killed instantly. The blast wave tore through what remained of the aircraft. The metal structure that had housed 2 men and thousands of pounds of equipment was gone. With the center of gravity shifting sharply backward, Mispa pitched into a near-vertical climb and began to stall. Swanson stared at empty space where his instrument panel should have been. At 30,000 feet, minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit cold air screamed through the gaping hole in the front of the cockpit, tearing at his flight suit. Blood from the explosion covered the flight deck, and through the void he could see the rest of the formation continuing toward the rally point. The control column, the yoke connected to the flight control system, had been mounted to the now destroyed forward structure, so it was gone. All instruments were lost too. The panel had been attached to the nose section, which was also obliterated. Swanson had no airspeed indicator, no altimeter, no artificial horizon, no way to know what the aircraft was doing except by feel and by staring at the horizon through the massive hole in front of him. But the control cables remained intact. The steel cables that ran from the cockpit back through the fuselage to the rudder, elevators, and ailerons were now exposed, hanging in the wind, but they were unbroken. Swanson forced the B-17's nose down. He didn't know how, with nothing to push or pull, but somehow he leveled the aircraft and rejoined the formation in a loose hold. The bomber should have been unflyable. Boeing engineers had designed the B-17 with inherent stability, but no engineer had planned for this scenario, and no manual covered flying without a cockpit. The only things keeping Mispa in the air were physics and sheer desperation. If you want to see how Swanson's crew pulled those bare cables to stay airborne, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. Now back to Swanson. Behind him, the surviving crew members, the radio operator and flight engineer, began moving forward. They could see the exposed cables running through the bomb bay and the wind tearing through the aircraft, and they knew exactly what needed to be done. Over 200 flak guns were still firing. The formation was still over enemy territory, and another shell was about to hit engine number 2. At 9:44 a.m., a second 88mm shell struck engine number 2. The right cyclone radial engine exploded in a spray of oil and metal fragments. Flames streamed back along the inboard section of the left wing. The propeller windmilled for 3 seconds, then seized up. Engine number 2 was dead, leaving Mispa with 3 engines instead of 4. The bomber began losing airspeed, and the formation pulled ahead. Without cockpit instruments, Swanson had no way to measure how fast they were falling behind. Technical Sergeant Frank Gamensi, the flight engineer, made his way forward from the top turret position. He saw the problem immediately. The control cables ran through the fuselage in bundles: elevator cables, rudder cables, aileron cables, each about 3/8 of an inch in diameter. Normally, they were enclosed in pulleys and fairleads hidden behind panels and structure. But now they were completely exposed, and the wind was yanking at them. Without someone physically holding the cable steady, the aircraft would become uncontrollable. Staff Sergeant George Simelli moved up from the radio compartment, and Staff Sergeant Robert Bell came forward from the waist gun position. They positioned themselves near the bomb bay, where the main cable runs were visible. There was no discussion, no debate. The situation was obvious. Someone had to hold these cables, and someone had to pull them when Swanson needed control. The problem was coordination. Swanson was sitting 40 feet forward in the remains of the cockpit. The crew was in the bomb bay area, and the intercom system was damaged. Communication would be nearly impossible. Swanson tried moving the rudder pedals, but nothing happened. The pedals were still attached to the floor, but the cables they normally actuated were being buffeted by 300 miles per hour winds. He tried the throttles, and engines 1, 3, and 4 responded. That was something. But without control over the flight surfaces, the B-17 would eventually spiral out of formation and into a dive, or worse, pitch up again, stall, and spin. Either way, everyone would die. The crew began pulling the cables. They wrapped sections of cable around their hands for grip. The steel was freezing cold and cut through their gloves. When they pulled left on the rudder cable, Mispa's nose moved left. When they pulled right, it moved right. The elevators worked the same way. Pull back, and the nose came up. Release, and it dropped. The challenge was that every input had to be perfectly timed. Too much pressure, and the aircraft would over-respond. Too little, and nothing would happen. And they were doing this without seeing what Swanson was seeing, without knowing what corrections he needed, and without any instruments or indicators. Mispa continued to fall behind the formation. The other B-17s maintained their cruising speed, heading southwest toward the Adriatic. Swanson's bomber was slower now. The drag from the missing nose section was enormous, and the destroyed engine meant less power. The formation couldn't wait. Every minute over Hungary meant more exposure to fighters and flak. Standard procedure was clear. Aircraft that couldn't maintain formation speed were left behind. By 9:46 a.m., Mispa was alone. The formation was a mile ahead, then 2 miles. Swanson could see them in the distance, a cluster of dark shapes against the summer sky. His own aircraft was losing altitude, not quickly but steadily. They had been at 30,000 feet over the target. Now they were at 29,000, then 28,000. The crew kept pulling the cables. Their hands were cramping, the cold was brutal, and blood circulation was being cut off by the pressure of the steel against their palms. But they didn't stop. The fuel situation was a mystery. The gauges were gone with the instrument panel. Swanson had no idea how much gasoline remained in the wing tanks, how long 3 engines could keep them airborne, or even if they were heading in the right direction. Navigation required instruments, a map, and a navigator, but the navigator was dead somewhere over Budapest. All Swanson knew was to fly southwest, get out of Hungary, get over Yugoslavia, get to the Adriatic, get to Italy, get home. Then the crew in the bomb bay started waving frantically toward the rear of the aircraft. Swanson couldn't turn around to look. The wind pressure through the open nose cavity made any movement dangerous. If he unbuckled from the pilot's seat, he could be pulled forward and out of the aircraft. He stayed locked in position, watching the horizon, trying to keep the wings level. But the crew kept waving. Something was wrong in the rear section, something beyond the missing nose, the dead engine, and the exposed control cables. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker, the tail gunner, had been in his position when the nose exploded. The tail section was the most isolated spot on a B-17, a small compartment at the very back of the fuselage, accessible only by crawling through the waist gun area on hands and knees. Tucker had felt the impact, felt the aircraft pitch up violently, then stabilize. But now he felt something else. The tail structure was flexing, the metal framework that held the vertical and horizontal stabilizers was moving in ways it shouldn't. The explosion had either created stress fractures in the fuselage or shrapnel had weakened critical support members. Either way, the tail section was beginning to fail. If the tail came off, everyone would die instantly. A B-17 without a tail would enter an unrecoverable spin, tumbling end over end until it disintegrated or hit the ground. There would be no time to bail out, no time to react. The crew in the bomb bay understood this. They could see the tail gunner's position through the fuselage, could see the structure moving, and had no way to fix it. Mispa was now at 26,000 feet, still descending, still heading southwest. Swanson estimated they had been flying without a cockpit for 4 minutes, maybe 5. Every second felt like an hour. The wind noise was deafening, the cold was penetrating every layer of his flight suit, and his hands on the throttles were going numb. But the throttles were the only controls he had left. Engine power was the only thing he could adjust without help from the crew pulling cables in the bomb bay. Second Lieutenant Paul Berndt, the co-pilot, was still in his seat. His control column was gone too, and his instruments were lost. But he was watching the wings, the engines, and scanning the sky for fighters. German Messerschmitt 10, 9s and Focke-Wulf 190s hunted lone bombers. A damaged B-17 separated from its formation was an easy target, with no defensive firepower from neighboring aircraft, no mutual support, just one crippled bomber losing altitude over enemy territory. But so far, no fighters appeared. The Luftwaffe was either engaged elsewhere or had not spotted Mispa yet. The crew kept pulling the cables, and their coordination was improving. When Swanson throttled back engine number 1, the aircraft wanted to yaw right. The crew compensated by pulling the left rudder cable. When he increased power on engine number 4, they adjusted again. This wasn't flying. It was collective survival through brute force. 10 men working as a single organism to keep 65,000 pounds of aluminum and steel in the air. At 9:50 a.m., Mispa crossed the Hungarian border into Yugoslavia. Swanson didn't know this. He had no map, no landmarks he could identify through the gaping hole where his cockpit used to be. But the flak stopped. The black clouds of explosions ceased, meaning they were out of the heaviest defensive zones. They might have a chance, a small chance, dependent entirely on how long the tail structure would hold, how long the crew could keep pulling cables, and how long 3 engines could generate enough thrust. The fuel gauges were gone, but Swanson could hear the engines, feel their vibration through the airframe. They were running smoothly, which meant fuel was still flowing. The wing tanks weren't empty yet. But how much remained was impossible to know. B-17S carried 2,800 gallons of aviation gasoline spread across multiple tanks. At cruise power, 4 engines burned roughly 200 gallons per hour, but they weren't at cruise power. They were at maximum continuous power on 3 engines, trying to maintain altitude and airspeed. That meant fuel consumption was much higher. Swanson made a decision: get the crew out. The aircraft was dying, the tail structure was failing, the fuel supply was unknown, and they were still over occupied territory. Every minute in the air increased the risk of total structural failure. If Mispa broke apart at altitude, no one would survive. But if the crew could bail out while the aircraft was still controllable, most of them would have a chance. They would be captured, spend months in prisoner of war camps, but they would be alive. The problem was execution. Bailing out of a B-17 required coordination. Standard procedure involved specific exit points. The bombardier and navigator used the forward escape hatch in the nose, but that hatch was gone. The radio operator and others used the waist gun windows or the rear door. The ball turret gunner had to rotate his turret to a specific position before climbing out. Each crew member had practiced this dozens of times in training, but training assumed the aircraft was intact. The pilot could communicate over the intercom, and there was time to organize an orderly evacuation. Swanson had none of those things. He had no intercom, no way to give the order, no way to coordinate who went first and who went last. And he couldn't leave his position. The moment he unbuckled, the moment he tried to move toward an exit, the aircraft would become uncontrollable. The crew in the bomb bay would lose any reference for which cables to pull, and the B-17 would enter a dive or spin within seconds. Everyone still aboard would die. At 9:52 a.m., Mispa was at 24,000 feet. They had been flying without a cockpit for 10 minutes. Swanson's hands were locked on the throttles, his feet on the rudder pedals, even though the pedals did nothing without the crew pulling cables 30 feet behind him. Bernd sat motionless in the co-pilot's seat, watching the horizon, the wings, looking for any sign of catastrophic failure. Neither man spoke. There was nothing to say, and the wind noise made conversation impossible anyway. The crew in the bomb bay made the decision themselves. They could feel the tail structure flexing, see the stress cracks spreading through the fuselage skin. They understood that staying aboard meant dying when the aircraft came apart. One by one, they began moving toward the waist gun windows. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell went first. He clipped his parachute harness, positioned himself at the window opening, and jumped. The slipstream took him instantly. Staff Sergeant Charles Kelly went next, then Staff Sergeant George Simelli, then Technical Sergeant Frank Gamensi. Each time a man jumped, the aircraft became harder to control. Fewer hands on the cables meant less precise inputs. The B-17 began wallowing, wings dipping left then right, nose pitching up slightly. Swanson adjusted throttle settings to compensate, but throttle alone was not enough. He needed the rudder, the elevators, the crew pulling cables, but the crew was abandoning ship. They had to. It was the only rational choice. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker crawled forward from the tail gunner position. He squeezed through the narrow passage, emerged in the waist gun area, and saw the empty positions where his crewmates had been standing moments before. He saw the exposed control cables now slack without hands holding them, saw the massive opening where the nose used to be 40 feet forward. He clipped on his parachute and jumped. By 9:54 a.m., 5 men had evacuated. 5 men were descending under parachute canopies over Yugoslavia. 5 men who would be captured by German forces within hours, but 5 men who would survive the day. That left 5 men still aboard Mispa, Swanson in the pilot seat, Bernd in the co-pilot seat, and 3 others who had not yet reached the exit points. The aircraft was at 22,000 feet, still descending, still barely controllable, and the tail structure was about to fail completely. The remaining crew members moved toward the exits. Staff Sergeant Paul Hish, a waist gunner, went through the window opening, his parachute deploying cleanly. Another waist gunner, Staff Sergeant Robert Tucker, followed seconds later. That left 3 men aboard, Swanson, Bernd, and 1 more crew member still making his way forward from a rear position. The aircraft was becoming increasingly unstable. With almost no one pulling the control cables, Mispa was responding only to engine power and inherent aerodynamic stability. Stability designed for normal flight conditions, not for flight without a nose section or with a failing tail structure. At 9:56 a.m., the last crew member reached the waist gun area, jumped, and disappeared into the slipstream. Swanson and Bernd were alone. 2 men in the remains of a B-17 flying fortress at 20,000 feet over Yugoslavia. The bomber was still descending, 3 engines still running, but it was no longer truly flyable. It was barely staying in the air through a combination of residual stability and the fact that the wings were still generating lift. Without crew members pulling cables, any significant control input was impossible. Swanson turned his head slightly and made eye contact with Bernd. No words were exchanged, the wind noise would have drowned out any conversation, but the message was clear. Bernd needed to go. There was no reason for the co-pilot to stay aboard. He had no controls, no function. If he stayed, he would die when the aircraft finally broke apart or crashed. The only rational choice was to bail out while altitude remained, while there was still time to deploy a parachute and survive the landing. Bernd unbuckled his harness, stood up from the co-pilot's seat, and moved carefully toward the rear of the flight deck to access the main fuselage and reach the waist gun exit. He looked back at Swanson one final time. The pilot was still locked in position, hands on throttles, eyes forward, holding the dying aircraft as steady as possible. Bernd climbed through the crawlway behind the cockpit and headed aft. 30 seconds later, he jumped. Evald Swanson was alone, 1 man in a 65,000-pound bomber at 19,000 feet. The aircraft was falling at approximately 200 feet per minute. Not a dive, just a steady descent. The three remaining engines were producing enough thrust to maintain forward speed, but not enough to hold altitude. The missing nose created massive drag. The aerodynamic profile was destroyed. The B-17 was essentially a flying brick with wings. The fuel situation remained unknown. The wing tanks could be nearly full or nearly empty. There was no way to tell. The engine sound gave no indication. Cyclone engines ran smoothly until the fuel supply was completely exhausted, then simply stopped. No warning, no sputtering, just silence. And if all three engines quit simultaneously, Mispa would drop out of the sky. Swanson estimated his position. They had been flying southwest for approximately 14 minutes since leaving Budapest. Airspeed was probably around 180 miles per hour, maybe less, meaning they had covered roughly 40 miles, maybe 45. The border between Hungary and Yugoslavia was approximately 30 miles from Budapest, so they were likely over Yugoslavia now, possibly approaching the mountains or the Adriatic coast. But all of this was guesswork. Without instruments, without maps, without a navigator, he was flying blind. The question was how long to stay aboard. Every minute at the controls meant the crew below had more time to distance themselves from the crash site. German patrols would search for a downed bomber, but if Swanson could keep Mispa flying for another few minutes, the crew members under parachutes would land miles away from where the aircraft eventually hit the ground. That separation could mean the difference between capture and evasion, between imprisonment and freedom. But staying aboard also meant increased risk of dying in the crash. The tail structure was still flexing. The bomber could break apart at any moment. And when Swanson finally decided to bail out, he would have to unbuckle, stand up, move through the aircraft to an exit point, and jump, all while the B-17 was uncontrolled, potentially entering a death spiral. At 9:58 a.m., Swanson made his final decision. He would stay with the aircraft for 2 more minutes, giving the crew more separation distance, a better chance. Then he would go. Swanson kept his hands on the throttles. The 3 Cyclone engines continued their steady roar. Engine number 1 on the far left wing, engine number 3 inboard on the right wing, engine number 4 on the far right wing. All running smoothly, all consuming fuel at an unknown rate. The bomber descended through 18,000 feet. At 10 a.m. exactly, Swanson released the throttles and unbuckled his harness. The moment the straps came loose, he felt the wind pressure trying to pull him forward toward the massive opening where the nose used to be. He pushed back against his seat, then stood up carefully. The aircraft immediately began to pitch. Without anyone controlling the throttles or making corrections, Mispa started a gentle left roll. Swanson moved quickly toward the rear of the flight deck, squeezing through the narrow crawlway that led to the bomb bay area. Behind him, the bomber's nose dropped. The control cables hung loose in the bomb bay. Nobody was pulling them now. Nobody was holding the aircraft steady. Swanson could feel the B-17 accelerating into a dive. He had maybe 30 seconds before the angle became too steep, before G-forces made movement impossible, before the aircraft entered a spin. He reached the waist gun area. The aluminum floor was vibrating under his boots. The wind noise was overwhelming. He grabbed his parachute pack from the storage rack, clipped it to his harness, and moved toward the window opening. The bomber was diving now, not vertically, but steeply enough that Swanson had to brace himself against the fuselage to stay upright. He positioned himself at the waist gun window, looked out at the Yugoslav countryside 17,000 feet below, and jumped. The slipstream hit him like a physical wall, spinning him sideways. The B-17 flashed past, engines still roaring, already 200 feet away and accelerating downward. Swanson pulled the ripcord. The parachute deployed with a violent jerk that knocked the wind from his lungs. Then silence. Relative silence. The roar of the engines faded as Mispa continued its dive. Swanson watched the bomber fall. The tail section was still attached, but barely, the entire rear fuselage flexing like a reed in the wind. At 15,000 feet, the tail separated. The B-17's forward section pitched nose down almost vertically, falling for another 8 seconds before disappearing into a line of trees 2 miles away. A column of black smoke rose moments later. The fuel tanks had ignited on impact. Nothing survived that crash. No one could have survived it. If Swanson had stayed aboard for another 30 seconds, he would be dead. The parachute descent was slow. Swanson drifted southwest with the prevailing wind. Below him, the Yugoslav landscape was dotted with scattered farms, forests, and small villages. Somewhere down there were German occupation forces, his crew members who had jumped minutes before him, and the reality that his war was over. He was about to become a prisoner. The ground came up faster than expected. Swanson could see trees. He tried to steer the parachute toward an open field, but the canopy wasn't designed for precision maneuvering. The trees were directly below him now. He hit the upper branches at approximately 15 miles per hour. Branches snapped, the parachute canopy caught on limbs. Swanson crashed through the foliage and slammed into a thick branch with his left side. He felt his left leg break. The bone snapped cleanly somewhere between the knee and ankle. Pain exploded through his nervous system. He fell another 10 feet and came to a stop, tangled in parachute lines and broken branches 15 feet above the ground. Blood was running down his leg, his flight suit was torn, and deep lacerations covered his left thigh where branches had cut through fabric and skin. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle. He couldn't move it, couldn't put weight on it, couldn't climb down from the tree. He hung there, suspended in the parachute harness, trying to control the pain, trying to stay conscious. Below him, he heard voices, German voices. German soldiers arrived at the base of the tree within minutes. They were Wehrmacht infantry, part of an occupation unit stationed in the area. They had seen the parachutes descending, heard the crash of the B-17, and now they were rounding up American aircrew. Swanson hung motionless in his harness, 15 feet above the ground, unable to move, unable to escape. One of the soldiers called up to him. Swanson didn't respond. The soldiers began discussing how to get him down. They found a ladder from a nearby farm. Two men climbed up and cut the parachute lines, lowering Swanson carefully to avoid worsening his leg injury. When they reached the ground, they laid him on his back in the dirt. A German medic arrived, examined the broken leg, lacerations and blood loss, then applied a temporary splint using wooden boards and strips of cloth. He injected morphine from a medical kit. The pain began to fade as the drug took effect, dulling the sharp agony in his leg to a distant throb. The medic wrapped the deep cuts with bandages and checked for other injuries. Ribs seemed intact, no head trauma, no detectable internal bleeding. The primary concern was the leg. Without proper treatment, infection would set in, and without surgery, the bone might not heal correctly. But for now, the medic had done what he could with limited supplies in a forest clearing. The Germans transported Swanson to a local command post, then to a Wehrmacht medical facility. A German doctor examined the leg, confirmed the fracture, and set the bone properly. The procedure was painful despite the morphine. Swanson passed out twice during the process. When he regained consciousness, his leg was in a plaster cast from ankle to hip. The doctor explained through an interpreter that the fracture was clean, the bone would heal, but Swanson wouldn't walk normally for months. Over the next 3 days, the rest of Mispa's crew was captured. All 8 men who had bailed out were found within a 20-mile radius of the crash site. None had evaded capture. The Yugoslav countryside was heavily patrolled. Partisan resistance groups operated in the mountains, but the crew had landed in farmland controlled by German forces. One by one, they were brought to the same processing center. Swanson saw them arrive. Burnt, Gmency, Simelli, Bell, Kelly, Tucker, Hish, all alive, all uninjured except for minor cuts and bruises. All now prisoners of war. They were transported to a prisoner of war camp in Austria, Stalag Luft 4, a facility specifically designated for captured Allied aircrew. The camp housed approximately 10,000 American and British pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and flight engineers. Conditions were harsh but not brutal. Food was limited. Red Cross parcels arrived irregularly. The barracks were cold in winter, and medical care was minimal. But the Germans generally followed Geneva Convention protocols for officer prisoners. No mass executions, no systematic torture, just confinement, boredom, and waiting. Swanson's leg healed slowly. He spent the first 2 months on crutches. The cast came off in September 1944. Physical therapy was basic. He walked around the camp perimeter every day to rebuild strength in the damaged leg. By October, he could walk without assistance. By November, the limp was barely noticeable. By December, he was physically recovered. But the war continued. The camp remained locked. Guards patrolled the wire, and escape attempts were rare and mostly unsuccessful. The crew of Mispa settled into the routine of captivity. They talked about the mission, the 88mm shell, the 10 minutes they flew without a cockpit, pulling the control cables by hand, watching their bomber fall into the Yugoslav forest, Dudley and Henderson who died instantly when the nose exploded, and how close they all came to dying that day. And they waited. Waited for the war to end, waited for liberation, waited to go home. Winter turned to spring. The Germans began evacuating camps as Soviet forces advanced from the east. Prisoners were marched westward in long columns. Conditions deteriorated, food became scarce. Some men died during the forced marches, others escaped in the chaos. Swanson and his crew stayed together, marching through Germany as the Third Reich collapsed around them. On April 30th, 1945, American forces reached their column. They were free. 9 months of captivity ended on a dirt road in central Germany. American tanks rolled past, soldiers distributed food, water, and cigarettes, and medical personnel checked for injuries and disease. The former prisoners were transported to collection points, then to airfields, then back to Italy, and eventually to the United States. The crew of Mispa went home, all 8 survivors, all 8 men who had pulled control cables by hand at 30,000 feet over Budapest. All 8 men who had jumped from a dying bomber and lived. Evald Swanson returned to civilian life in Michigan. He married, raised a family, and worked quietly for decades. He rarely spoke about July 14, 1944. When asked, he would say only that he had been lucky, the crew had been lucky, and Dudley and Henderson had not been lucky. He did not consider himself a hero. He considered himself a pilot who had done his job under impossible circumstances. The Army Air Forces disagreed. Swanson was promoted over the following years, eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel. The recognition was not for a single mission, but for a career of service. But that single mission remained the defining moment. The 10 minutes without a cockpit, the 10 minutes that should have killed everyone aboard. The crew stayed in contact, attending the 483rd Bomb Group reunions, gathering every few years to remember the war, the missions, and the men who did not return. The bond between them was unbreakable. They had survived something that should not have been survivable. They had flown a bomber with no nose, no instruments, no cockpit, in bare control cables exposed to 300 miles per hour winds. They had done it through coordination, determination, and the simple refusal to give up. And they had honored Dudley and Henderson by surviving, by making sure their sacrifice meant something. Paul Berndt, the co-pilot, stayed in Michigan near Swanson. They remained friends until the end. Frank Gamensi returned to his family and rarely discussed the war. George Simelli kept photographs from the mission, showing them to his grandchildren decades later, explaining what it meant to pull steel cables while a bomber fell apart around you. The others scattered across the country, but they remembered. They all remembered. Evald Swanson died in 2009 at the age of 89. He had lived a full life, seen the world change, watched aircraft evolve from propeller-driven bombers to jets to spacecraft. But the aircraft he remembered most clearly was Mispa, the B-17G that lost its nose over Budapest, the bomber that flew on borrowed time and crew determination, the aircraft that proved human will could overcome engineering limits. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about bomber crews who refused to quit when physics said they should. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Evald Swanson and the crew of Mispa don't disappear into silence. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley died instantly when that 88mm shell hit. Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson died beside him. They were 23 and 24 years old. They never came home. But the 8 men who survived carried their memory forward for 9 months in a prisoner of war camp, for decades afterward in Michigan and across America. And now through this story, their names live on. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen. If you like this story, please subscribe to my channel, like this video, and turn on the notification bell. We will continue to bring you more touching military history stories. See you in the next video.